Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the most controversial moments in European history, why Napoleon betrayed Spain. Picture this, it's the early 19th century, the height of the Napoleonic Wars. Europe is a powder keg and Napoleon Bonaparte is the match. He's already conquered much of the continent, but one enemy remains undefeated, Great Britain. To bring Britain to its knees, Napoleon needs to cut off its lifeline, trade. Spain at this time is a shadow of its former self, ruled by the inept King Charles IV. Napoleon sees an opportunity to strike at Britain and expand his empire, but his decision to betray Spain would ignite a conflict that would change the course of history. To understand Napoleon's actions, we have to understand the situation he was in. By 1807, Napoleon's empire stretched from the Pyrenees to Russia. He was the master of continental Europe, but Britain, the naval power, remained undefeated. Napoleon's direct invasion failed at Trafalgar. He needed a new strategy. The answer lay in economics. Britain relied on trade. Napoleon's continental system aimed to cut off British trade. It was a bold move, but Portugal refused to comply. Napoleon saw an opportunity to make an example of Portugal. The continental system was Napoleon's attempt to stranglehold the British economy. He knew he couldn't defeat their navy after Trafalgar, so he aimed to cut off their trade routes. It was a war of attrition to starve Britain of resources. The system had some initial success, but there were loopholes. Smuggling became rampant, with British goods finding their way onto the continent. Portugal, an ally of Britain, refused to comply, infuriating Napoleon. He saw an opportunity to make an example of Portugal, but his intervention in Spain would have unforeseen consequences. To understand why Napoleon thought he could just waltz into Spain, we need to understand the state of the Spanish monarchy at the time. It was, to put it mildly, a mess. King Charles IV, while technically on the throne, was a weak and indecisive ruler. The real power behind the throne was his chief minister, Manuel de Godoy. Godoy was a controversial figure. A favorite of the Queen, he was widely seen as corrupt and incompetent. His policies had brought Spain to the brink of ruin. The Spanish people were deeply unhappy with their government, and the country was ripe for revolution. Napoleon saw this instability as an opportunity. He believed he could exploit the situation to his advantage, using the weakness of the Spanish monarchy to gain control of the country. He underestimated, however, the fierce pride of the Spanish people. In 1807, Napoleon and Spain signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau. On the surface, this treaty seemed like a mutually beneficial agreement. It allowed French troops to pass through Spain in order to invade Portugal, which had refused to join the continental system. But Napoleon had a secret agenda. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was in reality a Trojan horse. It gave Napoleon the pretext he needed to send his armies into Spain. Once French troops were inside the country, Napoleon had no intention of leaving. He would use his army to depose the Spanish king and install a puppet ruler in his place. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was a masterpiece of deception. It played on Spain's weakness and internal divisions, promising a share of the spoils from the conquest of Portugal. But Napoleon had no intention of honoring his end of the bargain. He saw Spain as a stepping stone, a way to tighten his grip on Europe and crush British influence. Imagine the scene: Napoleon in his opulent study, a map of Europe spread out before him. He traces his fingers across the Iberian Peninsula, a glint in his eye. He sees beyond the treaty, beyond the immediate military objectives. He sees a chance to reshape the continent in his image. The Spanish people, however, were not going to be pawns in Napoleon's game. They had a proud history, a fierce sense of independence. They might have resented their own government, but the prospect of being ruled by the French was intolerable. As French troops poured into Spain, the mood began to shift. What started as suspicion quickly turned into anger and resentment. The Spanish people saw through Napoleon's lies, recognizing the treaty for what it truly was, a betrayal. The presence of French troops on Spanish soil, coupled with Napoleon's increasingly overbearing demands, ignited a powder keg. Uprisings broke out across the country, fueled by a potent mix of patriotism and anger. The Spanish people, from peasants to nobles, took up arms against the invaders. Napoleon had underestimated the resolve of the Spanish people. The Peninsular War was unlike any conflict Napoleon had faced before. It wasn't a war fought on open battlefields between vast armies. It was a guerrilla war, a brutal and bloody struggle for the very soul of Spain. The Spanish people, fueled by a fierce national pride, rose up against the French invaders. From the Pyrenees to the Strait of Gibraltar, the Spanish countryside became a battleground. Small bands of Spanish guerrillas, known as guerrilleros, harassed the French troops relentlessly. They ambushed supply lines, attacked isolated outposts, and then melted back into the hills, frustrating Napoleon's generals. The Spanish people fought with a ferocity that shocked the French. They knew their land, they were fighting for their homes and families, and they were determined to drive the invaders out. The Peninsular War was a stark reminder that Napoleon, for all his military genius, could not conquer the will of a people determined to be free. The British, sensing an opportunity to strike back at Napoleon, sent troops to support the Spanish. The Duke of Wellington, who would later defeat Napoleon at Waterloo, cut his teeth in the Peninsular War. The Peninsular War was a costly distraction for Napoleon. It drained his resources, tied down his troops, and ultimately contributed to his downfall. So, was Napoleon's betrayal of Spain a calculated move or a reckless gamble? It was a bit of both. He saw an opportunity to exploit Spain's weakness and further his own ambitions, but he grossly underestimated the Spanish people's resolve. The Peninsular War became a quagmire for Napoleon, a bleeding wound that sapped his strength and ultimately contributed to his downfall. It proved that empires built on force and deception are built on shaky ground. What are your thoughts on Napoleon's actions? Was he a cunning strategist or a ruthless opportunist? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next